Content. Introduction to Ethics Unit 1 Nature and Scope of Ethics Unit 2 Importance and Challenges of Ethics Unit 3 Ethics in the History of Indian Philosophy Unit 4 Ethics in the History of Western Philosophy. 2 Ethical Foundations Unit 1 Human Values. Ethics. Content. Introduction to Ethics Unit 1 Nature and Scope of Ethics Unit 2 Importance and Challenges of Ethics Unit 3 Ethics in the History of Indian Philosophy Unit 4 Ethics in the History of Western Philosophy. 2 Ethical Foundations Unit 1 Human Values. Unit 2 Human Virtues Unit 3 Human Rights Unit 4 Human Duties. 3 Applied Ethics Unit 1 International Ethics Unit 2 Bioethics. Unit 3 Environmental Ethics Unit 4 Media Ethics. IV Current Ethical Debates Unit 1 Natural Moral Law. Unit 2 Deontology and Moral Responsibility Unit 3 Discourse Ethics. Unit 4 Social Institutions. Nature and Scope of Ethics. Unit 1 Nature and Scope of Ethics. Contents. 1.0 Objectives. 1.1 Introduction. 1.2 Moral Intuitionism. 1.3 Human Person in Search of Himself Herself. 1.4 Love and the Moral Precepts. 1.5 The Dynamics of Morality. 1.6 The Constant and the Variable in Morality. 1.7 Let us sum up. 1.8 Keywords. 1.9 Further readings and references. 1.0 Objectives. This unit aims at introducing the students to the philosophical need for ethics, starting from a brief discussion of moral law and how the human person in his or her process of growth intuits the ethical principles. Discussions pertaining to the dynamics of morality is undertaken to show how, on the one hand, new situations call for new responses from moral point of view, and on the other hand, certain fundamentals of ethics remain the same insofar as there is something of a common human nature adequately understood. 1.1 Introduction. Let us begin our study of nature and scope of ethics by understanding what we mean by moral law. But two things need to be clarified before we raise the question with which we are concerned here. First, the moral law is called law only metaphorically, or if one prefers, analogically. The primary meaning of law is a rule of action promulgated by him/her who is in charge of a community in view of the common good. This is called positive law. If the legislator is considered to be God, it is divine positive law. If the legislator is human person, and it is human positive law. Human positive law can further be subdivided according to what the common good aimed at, e.g. civil law, criminal law, commercial law, etc. In a case, a positive law lays down rules to be observed by human persons. It is prescription. Then there is another sense of law, which is quite different. In this sense, it is a formula expressing a constant of behavior of things and of persons. So we have physical law, including laws studied in physics, chemistry, biology, etc., psychological law, sociological law, etc. Since the constant of behavior among human persons is less fixed and foreseeable than that among things, it is more of a statistical constant. As distinct from positive law, this kind of law is called natural law. It is descriptive. It can also be called prescriptive to the extent if it is considered as willed by God and includes the divine positive law, and descriptive to the extent that this divine will is the ultimate cause of the constant of behavior in things and human persons. However, moral law corresponds exactly neither to the positive law nor to the natural law. On page 5. 6. Introduction to Ethics. Contrary, the sense of the absolute should is an immediate datum of the moral consciousness itself. Secondly, in the language of moral philosophers, moral law includes not only general and abstract rules of action, e.g., do good and avoid evil, or, in our language, the sense of the absolute should, but also particular and concrete precepts, e.g., help the poor, obey legitimate authority, be truthful, do not kill the innocent, adultery is wrong, etc. These particular and concrete precepts we are here calling the specifications of the moral law. Hence our question, how are the general data of the moral consciousness particularized and concretized in specific precepts, and what is the cause of this difference among men? In terms of moral value, we can raise this question as follows. If the moral value par excellence is human person's self-realization as human, how can this moral value determine specific moral values? And why is there disagreement as to whether such and such an action is of good moral value or not? 1.2 Moral Intuitionism. All deontological theories agree that there must exist some rule or law which enforces moral value, and that it is natural to human person, intuitively known. There is then an element of intuition in all of them, no matter how they conceive of it and the way they approach it, whether as conscience, Occam, Logos, Stoics, moral sense, Shaftesbury, the a priori categorical imperative, Kant, right reason, Thomas Aquinas, and Suarez. This element of moral intuition is also found in the teleological theories, whether implicitly or even explicitly. It is implicitly found in the concept of autarxia, Epicurus in that of eudaimonia, Aristotle, and explicitly in the concept of right reason, Hobbes in the conscientious feelings of mankind, Mill. And in fact, the more the idea of moral obligation is prominent in an ethical theory, the more explicit becomes the recourse to this element of intuition or direct perception. This element of intuition is strongly emphasized by metaethicists who maintain that moral language is objective and therefore unformative. But here again, they differ as to what the object of this moral intuition is. This difference is explainable by the difference in their meta-ethical theories regarding the meaning of moral good. Hence, for some, this object is the rightness of specific acts, Pritchett. For others, it is a kind of moral property, simple and indefinable in non-moral terms. More for others, it is a general principle, e.g., the principle of utility itself, situate, or set of principles, e.g., the prima facie duties of fidelity, reparation, gratitude, justice, beneficence, self-improvement, and non-maleficence. Gross. In ethics, the philosophy which insists on the necessity of moral intuition is called ethical intuitionism. But even the most insistent of all moral philosophers on this element of intuition in the moral consciousness, namely Kant, not only does not deny, but, on the contrary, explicitly states that the moral judgment includes elements derived from experience which are therefore a posteriori, as opposed to the a priori element. Kant denies the possibility of deriving particular and concrete moral precepts from the concept of practical reason alone. For this, the study of human nature is necessary. 7. Nature and scope of ethics. Similarly, Thomas Aquinas distinguishes between the first principles of the synthesis which are self-evident, intuitively known by all, and which cannot be deleted from the human heart, and the secondary and more specific principles which are derived from the former, as if by way of conclusion from premises. What is implied here is that the secondary principles require reflection. Thomas speaks of the difficulty involved in applying general principles to concrete cases. Even though principles, whether theoretical or practical, can be evident in themselves, they may not be so evident to us. And this is due, according to Thomas, to wrong persuasions on the part of human person. Soares is perhaps even more explicit in his doctrine that even the secondary principles, which like the primary are self-evident in themselves, require a certain amount of thought and experience. This is truer of the tertiary principles which require study and discursive thought. But all moral principles can be derived from self-evident principles. One notable difference between Thomas and Soares is that the former derives the concrete principles in a way corresponding to human person's natural inclinations, the latter derives them in a way corresponding to a legal system. For Soares, these precepts have their immediate norm, the good of human nature. The need of experience and reflection is similarly, indeed even more, insisted upon by contemporary ethicists. Why this greater insistence? 1.3 Human person in search of himself, herself. What we are dealing with here is to see whether a general principle such as serious promises should not be lightly broken is self-evident and therefore be counted among the first principles intuitively known by everybody. If yes, how is it derived from the very first self-evident principle that good is to be done, evil to be avoided? Is it merely by a kind of logical deduction? And if it is self-evident in itself but not known by all, is it because of some accidental reason such as ignorance or bad habit? Finally, if it is not self-evident, how is it that human person has today come to agree that such a general principle is correct, that it is a moral value? To speak more specifically of thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, Soares, and Ross, are we to say that the examples they give of first principles of prima facie duties are meant to serve merely as examples, or are we to say that they are meant to be included among the first principles themselves? In the first case, we could perhaps disagree that the examples they give are good examples, but still agree with their doctrine that there exist first principles intuitively known by every man. The question would be then, which are these first principles? In the second case, to question the aptness of the examples would be to question their doctrine itself. Irrespective of what such thinkers actually mean, we have got to study the problem in itself. If there is any principle that cannot be denied, it is the immediate data of moral consciousness. If these data cannot be denied, they are self-evident. They are self-evident not as principles, that is, as formulae, but as data, whether they are thematically formulated or not. The immediate ontological foundation of the moral obligation is human interrelatedness, and that the norm for moral good, as distinct from the moral right, is human person as a social being. We have also reflected how the only moral precept which is immediately given, that is 8. Introduction to ethics, self-evident and cannot be justified on a mere moral level, is that human person should be human as an individual and social being. Hence, all other precepts, what we are here calling specifications of the moral law, must somehow or other flow from this fundamental precept that a person should realize himself, herself as human. Human consciousness is in a process of becoming. Human person is becoming moral and more himself, and in the process his awareness of himself develops. She has been continuously asking himself the question what he is. Human person is in a never-ending search of himself, herself. The more she grows, the more she becomes conscious of himself, herself as human person, the more she is himself, herself. Moral consciousness is a part or an aspect of human consciousness. The more human person becomes himself, herself, the more she becomes conscious of what she should be. This leads to the emergence of moral precepts specifying ever more clearly the conduct of human person. Hence, the moral precepts, moral values, flow from the first fundamental moral precept that human person should be himself, herself, the moral value par excellence, not by way of mere logical deduction or of mere mediate inference. The former are related to the latter not simply as logical conclusions or as implicitly correlated to their premises. Logic has got to do with ideas, with mere ideas. It cannot be denied that this relation of the explicit to the implicit, of the clear to the unclear of the concrete to the abstract, is here present. But it is present in the sense that a continuously developing human consciousness is related to its status, past, and future of its development. Existence is more than logic. If what we are saying about the progressive development of human consciousness, and therefore of moral consciousness, is true, one can easily understand the development of morals from the caveman to modern human person, from ancient slavery to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was approved without a dissenting voice in the United Nations General Assembly in 1948. Ignorance of the moral precepts is therefore not necessarily the result of perverse customs, as if this result were accidental. It is a fact of experience that perverse customs not only weaken the will to pursue the moral good but darkens the mind to recognize what the moral good is. But this is more easily possible on an individual level. Here we are placing ourselves on the level of mankind and its historical progress. This ignorance in the variety of morals can be explained by human historicity itself, that is, by the historical progressive development of his human moral consciousness. However, we must not easily take it for granted that this development has always and everywhere been a linear progress. It may have suffered setbacks, reverses, and regress. We need not go into that. What is more pertinent here to ask is whether we should reasonably suppose that human person has now attained the sum of his her self-consciousness, of his her moral consciousness. What is reasonable to suppose according to us is that she has not. Apart from the fact that one cannot predict the future, contemporary moral problem of the morality of abortion hinges to a great extent on whether one should consider the human fetus a human person. The so-called women's liberation movement indicates no matter what its merits and demerits are, that women have not been treated as full human persons everywhere in the world. One could think of many other nature and scope of ethics indications. If progress is still possible, it can only be done by the passage of time and on the part of human person by experience and by his reflection on his own experience. 1.4 Love in the moral precepts. Here we wish to bring into focus the most salient moments of our reflection on the subject, bringing them to bear upon the topic at hand. To recognize human interrelatedness as the immediate ontological foundation of the moral order and to act accordingly can be expressed in terms of love. Love is therefore the existential basis of the moral order. This leads us already to start thinking that love is the basic moral activity. The primary intuitively grasped demand that human person realizes himself as a human person as particularized and concretized in moral precepts. This too can be expressed in terms of love. Universal love is particularized and concretized, it is objectified in the moral precepts. Hence is love not just one moral virtue among others but the form of all of the moral virtues. So too love is not just one moral precept among others but it is the form of all of them. It is what makes moral precepts moral precepts. Indeed, it could hardly be called a precept since taken by itself in a non-objectified sense, it does not prescribe anything definite. And in the same way, one can hardly call the moral realization of oneself as human as an obligation. This too taken by itself in a non-objectified sense does not oblige human person to do anything specific. And there is hardly any meaning in the saying that human person should love. Love cannot be enforced, so too there is hardly any meaning in the saying that human person should fulfill himself as human. If love is the form of the moral precepts and if love, like human moral consciousness, is a progressive affair, this means that acting according to the moral precepts is acting according to love, but that this awareness admits of degrees. This means that love can also be considered to be not only the beginning of the moral life but also its end. At the beginning it is present as a seed which is more than mere potentiality but already an actuality, albeit in a seminal form. The seed can develop into a fully mature and fully conscious lobe. And if it is in love that human person perfects himself as human, it is in this fully mature and fully conscious love that she does so. Many factors go in this process of maturing of self-fulfillment. No matter how logically we can distinguish one human faculty or aspect of human person from another human person as a totality, one integrated whole. As it is not the intellect which understands but human person by his intellect, so too it is not with his her heart that human person loves but human person by his heart, but heart as one's whole being. Love is an existential relation involving my whole existence. Suffice it here to remark already that though human person can develop one or other of his her faculties independently of the rest, or at least quasi-independently, one cannot develop himself herself as a human person without developing the core of his her being, namely his her love, and this is not achieved by mere study and reflection, although these can be very useful, but by doing. As scholastics say, the operation is the perfection of being. 9. 10. Introduction to Ethics. 1.5 The Dynamics of Morality. Here we examine two questions which are intimately linked. In an evolutionary visions of human person, to what extent can we say that morality, that is, the specification of the moral law, are universally valid for all human persons? To what extent can we say that they are unchangeable? If one maintains their universal validity, one is charged with absolutism, withholding the opinion of a static nature of human person incompatible with present-day theories about man's dynamic and evolutionary nature. If on the other hand one were to maintain a relative validity, one would fall into a philosophically untenable moral relativism. Can the dilemma be overcome? The evolutionary nature of human person and of his human consciousness has long been recognized one way or another. Charles Darwin gave the theory of evolution a biological basis. An evolutionary view of the world and of human person is today at the basis of a great deal of scientific, philosophical, and theological thinking. The thinking of such human persons as Pierre Teilhard de Chardin and of Aurobindo comes of course spontaneously to mind. Herbert Spencer is perhaps the best known evolutionary ethicist. He starts by observing that both human and animal conduct consist in acts adjusted to ends. The higher we proceed in the scale of evolution, the easier it becomes for us to obtain evidence of purposeful actions directed toward the good either of the individual or of the species. This purposeful activity forms part of the struggle for existence waged between individual members of the same species or between different species. But this type of conduct is, according to Spencer, an imperfectly evolved conduct. In a perfectly evolved conduct, which is ethical conduct in the proper sense of the word, this struggle for existence will yield place to cooperation and mutual help. Egoism and altruism will be both transcended. This leads Spencer to distinguish between absolute and relative ethics. Absolute ethics is an ideal code of conduct formulating the behavior of the completely adapted human person in the completely evolved society. Relative ethics is the nearest approximation to this ideal according to the more or less perfectly evolved society in which human person happens to find him/her. Spencer adopts the utilitarian ethical principle. In fact, he takes happiness to be the ultimate end of life and measures the rightness or wrongness of actions by their conduciveness to this end. From a nascent state when this utilitarian principle was dependent on non-ethical, e.g. authoritarian beliefs, it gradually developed to become independent, and as suggested by the theory of evolution, it will continue to evolve and reach an ideal limit. Happiness, however, depends on the fulfillment of some conditions. And these conditions are the observances of certain principles and rules which causally determine human welfare. Spencer acknowledges the existence of moral intuitions which, however, are the slowly organized results of experience received by the race. In other words, an induction from experience handed down from one generation to the other ends up by becoming an instinctive moral reaction. Evolution is moving towards the emergence of the highest form of life. Happiness is the supreme end of human person as the concomitant, and virtue is the condition for its attainment. In the preface of the fifth and sixth parts of his The Principles of Ethics, subsequently withdrawn, Spencer confesses that the theory of evolution 11. Nature and scope of ethics has not provided as much practical guidance as he had hoped. What is peculiarly Spencer's is his interpretation of evolution as a teleological process directed towards the establishment of a higher and higher moral order. 1.6 The constant and the variable in morality. Whether or not man has.
Thank you.